Hello, everyone. I'm about to read from this book, which was my first book about Ernest Satow, The Diaries and Letters of Sir Ernest Mason Satow, 1843 to 1929, a scholar diplomat in East Asia. And there he is there. A very young version of me is on the back cover. This book was, as I say, my first publication, Satow publication, first ever book I'd written, and it was translated into Japanese by Nagaoka-san, Nagaoka Shozo, and Sekiguchi Hideo. But my main inspiration in writing the Orange book was, in fact, Nagaoka-san, because he helped me a great deal. And then he translated what I'd done. And so I think I'd better dedicate this video to him and to Sekiguchi-san. I will do my best to read it as nicely as I can. Well, I'm just opening the book now, and first thing I come across is something from the publisher, Edward Mellon Press, which starts, "Valued author." I rather like that way of addressing an author. It says, "Please accept this card as confirmation of the safe receipt of your manuscript. Thank you for their submission. We will be in touch with you again in due course, assuring you of our continued close attention. Edwin Mellon Press, Mellon House, Lampeter." That's in Wales. Okay, so they received the manuscript and they sent me a little postcard to me at Q-Tech to tell me they'd done that. And that was in, well, the postmark is Lampeter, Dyfed, 28th of April, 1998. And it was published in 1998. So anyway, The Diaries and Letters of Sir Ernest Mason Satow, 1843 to 1929, a scholar diplomat in East Asia, selected, edited, and annotated by Ian C. Ruxton, the Edward Mellon Press, Lewiston, Queenston, and Lampeter. Lewiston and Queenston are somewhere in the US, I think. Yes, New York. Lewiston is in New York and Queenston is in Ontario. So, and then there's Lampeter in Wales. So three addresses for this publisher. I dedicated it to my parents, the book. The table of contents I'm looking at now, we've got acknowledgements, foreword, preface by William Corr. Chapters: 1, Early Life and Upbringing, 1843 to 1862. 2, Early Years in Japan, 1862 to 1869. 3, Japan, 1870 to 1883. 4, what I called the wilderness years. I got some criticism for that. But the wilderness years, 1884 to 1894. Then chapter 5, Japan, 1895 to 1900. And then chapter 6, China, 1900 to 1906. Chapter 7, Retirement, 1907 to 1929. So I tried to make it the 7 ages of man and make 7 chapters accordingly, which I think worked reasonably well. I think his life does divide fairly naturally into those segments. Then there was a postscript and final assessment, appendices, including a list of Satow's publications, Satow family tree, important dates during his lifetime, and then Japanese prime ministers and cabinets, British ministers to Japan, British prime ministers, British foreign secretaries, and under-secretaries of state for foreign affairs mentioned in the text. And then notes, a bibliography and index, and that was the whole thing. Okay, so it went as far as how many pages? Well, in terms of Roman numerals, the last page is 511, but before that you've got the introductory part, which is in, 511 is in Arabic numerals, and the first part is Roman, as far as page 17. Anyway, whatever that comes to. So acknowledgements. Yeah, quite a few people I've acknowledged. Probably won't read. I won't read all of these. I've also acknowledged the Public Record Office, National Archives as it is now, the Yokohama Archives of History, the Library of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Jardine Matheson Company, and Cambridge University Library. All residual errors of whatever kind are mine. Conventions, Japanese names are given in the proper Japanese order with the surname preceding the given name, except where preceded by Mr. I have added in pencil. Macrons are not used for long vowels as my software does not have them. That was April 1998, I wrote that. Nowadays, my software does have macrons. You'll be pleased to know. Okay, so the foreword I wrote, and it's quite short. I'll read it now. In the course of writing this introduction to the life and times of Sir Ernest Satow, or rather piecing together what seems to be a vast jigsaw puzzle, of which not all the pieces have yet been located, I have attempted to let my subject speak for himself as much as possible, chiefly through his diaries and letters, which contain a massive amount of material. Yes, indeed. There are, of course, merits and demerits to this approach, but it is my belief that there is something here for both the specialist historian and the general reader. My main aim has been to inform rather than to interpret. I am aware that there is a great deal more to be written to explain each aspect of Satow's long and remarkable life, and that in trying to reveal the whole life, I may have skimmed over certain aspects and left some loose ends. For this reason, I do not feel able to claim that this work is a biography in the strict sense of the word, but I hope it may serve as a starting point for one. Certainly, Satow deserves a substantial biography. Furthermore, I have preferred generally to follow the chronology of events as they happened rather than dividing each chapter according to themes. Where it seemed helpful, I have made use of secondary sources, including the excellent work of several previous Satow scholars, and added some headings. In so doing, I am conscious that the result may seem to some readers to lack integration or added value and be unduly repetitious in parts, but that, as Satow himself might have said, is for wiser heads, in inverted commas, to consider. Indeed, not all of Satow's writing makes for attractive reading, and his prose style was at times verbose, but we should not judge too harshly from the perspective of the late 20th century, or indeed from the perspective of now, I would say. Okay, next is the preface by William Corr. I'm afraid I don't know what's happened to Bill Corr. If anybody watching this can tell me, I'd be very grateful. Just leave a comment or send me an email or something. You can leave a comment after in the notes below, comments below. All right. So, preface. When late in 1862, the young Ernest Satow arrived in Japan as a student interpreter to the British legation, he found pitifully few materials available for systematic study of either the land or the language. A thin pamphlet of phrases in the Nagasaki dialect by the Reverend J. Liggins, a Japanese vocabulary of sorts published in Batavia in the Dutch East Indies, a Dutch-Japanese grammar translated into French, Rutherford Alcock's sadly flawed Japanese grammar text, and little else were available. Nonetheless, within a very few years, Satow was among the most distinguished of Japanese linguists. His name widely known and respected among the educated and politically aware classes of Japan, I should say. For all but the most wretched of the urban poor, the Victorian age in England was one of confidence, dynamism, and optimism. The United States took little part in world affairs, and Britain, her empire seemingly impregnable and her navy quite unrivaled at sea, carefully avoided direct confrontation with France and Russia, the two continental powers which harbored most resentment towards her. Before the submarine telegraph connected the capitals of the world, diplomats of the 19th century could, and occasionally did, decide their country's foreign policy as circumstances required. Ernest Satow proved an unsurpassed chronicler of the events which led to the overthrow of the rotten, tottering Bakufu shogunate and its replacement by a restored imperial house supported by ambitious and vengeful southern clans. This train of events, seemingly as inevitable as a Greek tragedy, Satow was later to describe in an outstandingly evocative memoir, A Diplomat in Japan, which I may read at some point for YouTube. Intriguingly, The young Ernest Sato was, in no small part, instrumental in that tumultuous process of bloody upheaval, dynastic overthrow, and imperial restoration in Japan. For in 1866, while still only 22, he had written 3 untitled and anonymous articles about political conditions in Tokugawa Japan for the Japan Times. Shortly afterwards, these became known in Japanese as Eikoku Sakuron, British policy, and were assumed widely but quite erroneously to be official British policy towards the gathering storm. Sato's unambiguous reference to the worn-out pretense of acknowledging the tycoon to be the sole ruler of Japan, that part is in inverted commas, and his acknowledgement of the existence and de facto power of the Confederate daimyos of Japan was widely assumed to be a clear statement that Britain intended no hindrance to the southern clans should they attempt to overthrow the Tokugawa. Like the Jesuit I don't speak Portuguese. Like the Jesuit João Rodrigues in the time of Tokugawa Ieyasu over 2 centuries earlier, Ernest Sato arrived in Japan when still young and capable of learning quickly. Despite being obliged to fulfill the mundane obligations of chancery work, his progress in gaining mastery of the language was outstanding. More to the point, his quick intelligence led him to the conclusion that Tokugawa power was in a state of irreversible decay. The machinery of state government, which had been constructed so skillfully that a child could have manipulated it, as he was to memorably phrase it in later years, was no longer capable of coping with the greatest object of dread the Tokugawa dynasty had feared and abhorred for over 2 centuries, the arrival of foreigners with immensely superior naval and military technology. From the early 17th century until the advent of Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry's United States Navy squadron of fearsome smoke-belching paddle-wheel ironclads in July 1853, Japan's rulers had all but sealed the door to the outside world. A trickle of closely supervised trade was permitted with Korea and China. The commercially astute Dutch possessed a virtual monopoly of trade between Batavia and Nagasaki, although their traders sequestered status on Dejima, an artificial island in Nagasaki harbor originally built to confine the Portuguese, was a subject for envious derision in Europe. Curiously, the Japanese authorities, who could have learned much about the contemporary world through the good offices of the compliant and obliging Dutch, deliberately refrained from doing so. Did they? I thought there was a whole school of Rangaku studying Dutch texts. That's interesting. Although Holland was one of the most prosperous, successful, and thriving countries in Europe, possessing a technology barely inferior to that of Britain and a standard of living second to none in Europe, the trade between Batavia and Nagasaki was essentially one of crude barter of copper for lead, with a few luxury goods also changing hands as amusing novelties and interesting curiosities. Of steam pumps, scientific land surveying, the steamship, the telegraph, the hot air balloon, and much more besides, the Japanese remained contentedly ignorant. Well, maybe so, but there certainly were studies of Dutch books going on. The Nagasaki interpreters and translators of Dutch had become a hereditary caste, primarily interested in guarding its privileges and perquisites. When the Opium War between Britain and China made it abundantly clear that Japan could not long remain closed to the world, the Dutch monarch wrote to the Tokugawa shogunate, earnestly requesting reconsideration of the grotesquely anachronistic policy of sakoku, national seclusion. The advice was ignored. The men commanding the shogunate in its final years were not at all the diplomatic equals of those who had founded the dynasty. Mercifully, the Americans under Commodore Perry came not to conquer, but to demand the signing of treaties concerning the succor of shipwrecked mariners and the supply of water and fresh food to American ships. The tiny port of Shimoda, not far from the shogunal capital of Edo, and Hakodate in remote Hokkaido were opened to commerce after a lengthy comedy of errors. In brisk order, Japan signed similar treaties with Britain, France, and Russia, and soon other coastal towns and villages were opened for Western settlement. The Yokohama of which Sato found himself a resident was a treaty port, with its extraterritoriality guaranteed by binding international treaties. Foreigners of all reputable classes and others whom Sir Rutherford Alcock so extravagantly dubbed the scum of Europe, that's in inverted commas, built houses, warehouses, clubs, schools, and churches. Some, hardly surprisingly, patronized less reputable quarters of the settlement, while their Chinese servants risked their lives in dealing in opiates. Conflicts between the more xenophobic elements among the Japanese and the undesired barbarians on their shores were inevitable. A few Europeans and their servants were assassinated at random. The British legation in Edo was burned to the ground, and foreign vessels were fired on by the guns of southern clans, the ancestral foes of the Tokugawa. By an odd paradox, foreign punitive expeditions against such clans as the Satsuma had the effect of encouraging intimate relations between those same clans and such men as Sato, while simultaneously deepening the clan's hatred and loathing of the Tokugawa shogunate. Ironically, during the struggle which overthrew the shogunate, the Americans played no part at all. Their internecine civil war and its bitter aftermath exhausted them for nearly a generation. Instead, mirroring a score of rivalries from Egypt to Siam, the French supported the Tokugawa almost to the bitter end, while the British, nominally neutral, were seen by all in Japan as in favor of the imperial restoration. In practice, this meant that Her Britannic Majesty's emissaries favored those ambitious southern clans, primarily the Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa, who were using the rallying cry of imperial restoration as a cover for their own political ends. Sato's intimate connection with Japan was to last for well over half a century. His valet at his death, Honma Saburo, was in his service for over 50 years, and Sato assumed complete financial responsibility for Takeda Kane, his Japanese common law wife, and educational responsibility for his two surviving children by her, both sons. He never married her. A letter of his written in 1897 gives us a plausible clue why not. It was then, and for a very long while later, the case that an imprudent marriage might, and often did, ruin a promising man's career in the consular or diplomatic service. Sato was to have other careers and interests in what has been described as his aloof maturity. He served in Siam, Uruguay, Morocco, and China, and was to become a distinguished scholar and an authority on international law, yet his early association with Japan necessarily remains the most vivid and enduring episode of a long and fascinating life. And great thanks are due from me to Bill Corr for that very good introduction. And then we go to chapter 1, which I do propose to read now. Chapter 1, Early Life and Upbringing, 1843 to 1862. Family, Childhood, and School Days. Beginning with a quotation. My father was a strict disciplinarian, and we were brought up in habits of obedience. Any serious deviation in conduct was punished by a horsewhipping administered by a whip which he called the Black Friend. It stood behind his armchair in the corner of the dining room. We all experienced the attentions of the Black Friend, but not very often. This is from Ernest Satow's Family Chronicle of the English Satow's, published in 1925, privately printed at Oxford. Ernest Mason Satow was born at 10 Buccleuch Terrace in Clapton, a quiet and respectable middle-class area of terraced houses and green parkland in northeast London on the 30th of June, 1843. In the same year, the world's first underwater tunnel was completed under the River Thames, and Nelson's column was erected in Trafalgar Square. The conservative and hard-working Queen Victoria, 1819 to 1901, had ascended the throne in 1837, and the First Opium War had just ended in China in 1842. Britain's pride in its economic progress and confidence in its engineering and military achievements were soaring. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels came to reside permanently in Britain in 1849. Japan was visited for the first time by the Black Ships commanded by Commodore Perry in 1853, when Ernest was 10 years old. The first major commercial treaty between Britain and Japan was signed in 1858, and the American Civil War began in 1861. Ernest Satow was the third son in a typically large Victorian family comprising 6 brothers and 5 sisters. The family lived first at number 4 Hadlow Cottages in Upper Clapton, then at number 10 Buccleuch Terrace, then in a house near the city, and lastly at number 4 Lower Terrace. These houses and addresses are no longer in existence. However, a small photograph of the back of what must be one of them, a dark and rather gloomy 3-story building, is included in the first volume of Satow's diary with the playfully ironic title Satow Castle. Middlesex is written below on the same page, and Clapton is not now in Middlesex, but in the London borough of Hackney. However, Middlesex was much larger until 1888, when it lost 50 square miles and 2.5 million inhabitants to the then County of London. Clapton became fashionable as a residential area for the relatively wealthy financiers of the City of London in the mid-19th century. It was a quiet but convenient suburb with large houses and gardens in a leafy setting by the River Lee. And I've actually lived near there briefly. Satow's father David was technically a Swedish national, though of German extraction, until he chose to become a British national in 1846, 3 years after Ernest was born. And I have a copy of his certificate of naturalization to become a British citizen. His full name was Hans David Christoph, later anglicized to Christopher Satow. His mother Margaret was English. Her maiden name was Mason. Satow's father was born in 1801 at a seaport on the southern shores of the Baltic called Wismar, W-I-S-M-A-R. The Satow family line has been traced back to Joachim Hinrich Satow, who died on the 13th of August, 1747. Satow is the name of a small, little-known and unremarkable village on the road between Wismar and Rostock in Mecklenburg province in the eastern part of Germany, and it is clear that the Satow family name came from the place name, which meant village of the sower, indicating its agricultural preoccupations. Satow is a common name in that part of Mecklenburg. The original German pronunciation sounds like Zato, although the name is of West Slavic origin and was brought by Wendish or Sorbian immigrants to this part of Germany, possibly in the Middle Ages. The pronunciation was later anglicized to Satow, pronounced either with a short or more correctly a long A, as I do, as in the British version of tomato. Although the former sounds not unlike Sato, a common Japanese family name, a fact which was to stand Sato in good stead in later years, the coincidence is purely fortuitous. It causes much confusion even to this day. Yes, there are lots of people who think he's Japanese because they pronounce, or his name is pronounced in Japan, Sato, but he's not. As for the name Ernest, by family tradition, it apparently came from the doll Ernest Augustus, named after the King of Hanover, owned by Ernest's eldest sister, Selina, who died in May 1852 of tuberculosis. Shortly after the birth, when Margaret Satow was dandling the infant boy on her knee and wondering what to call him, she heard Selina going upstairs and talking to her doll. The name seemed to fit. The port of Wismar changed hands 3 times, from Sweden to the Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin to France in the turbulent Napoleonic period. So in 1808, Ernest's grandfather, who dealt mainly with London, decided to move to the Latvian port of Riga, seeking more settled conditions for his mercantile business. In particular, he was affected by the ban issued by Napoleon on trade with England. This forced him to move to Riga outside French jurisdiction. However, in 1812, Napoleon advanced on Russia, prompting Satow's grandfather to take the extraordinary step of packing the 11-year-old David off in a merchant ship to travel around the world. He probably worked as a cabin boy. In 1814, he returned to go to school and then joined the firm of a merchant by the name of Schnackenburg, where he learned business practices. At the age of 24, he moved to England, that's in 1825, seeking to establish his own business and make his fortune there. In this venture, he was supported financially by Schnackenburg, that's Schnakenburg, and his elder brother Andreas. He received about £500 from each of them, which became his initial capital. Andreas was the closest of David's brothers and sisters and visited him in London in 1859. In 1832, David Satow married Margaret Mason, the daughter of a law stationer, and made London his permanent home. She was 11 years his junior, and they had met at the Nonconformist Chapel in Poultry, a small lane in the city of London, where the Mason family worshipped. They lived for a time in Jury Street near the Tower of London, where David managed a counting house, buying and selling land and dealing in financial matters. By 1835, David had made enough money to buy a house in Clapton while retaining his office in Jury Street. Bernard M. Allen wrote an overly laudatory brief memoir entitled The Right Honourable Sir Ernest Satow, GCMG, which was published 4 years after Satow's death in 1933. He was actually a cousin of Satow, I think. His biography of Charles George Gordon, the soldier who played an important part in China, was published in the same year. Allen described Satow's family as having been brought up on typical Victorian lines. Satow's father, who after all his early wanderings settled down to the routine of an English business life, was a strict Lutheran and a regular attendant at the Nonconformist Chapel in Clapton. So strict and dull was he that on Sundays after the obligatory chapel service, the Satow children were not allowed to read anything other than the Bible. All the toys were put away and the 10 Commandments were recited repeatedly. Hans David Satow believed in the exercise of parental authority and in the occasional use of the rod, but he did not rule by fear alone, and both father and mother knew how to win the affection as well as the esteem of their children. He was also a member of the committee of the German hospital at Dalston in South Hackney from 1848 to 1873. He died aged 73 in 1874 at Myrtle Lodge, Sidmouth in Devon. That's Myrtle, Myrtle, which he had bought as a country retreat 6 years earlier. Satow describes him as being fond of boating and billiards. He detested the French from his boyhood experiences, and he was, in quotation marks, a thoroughly loyal and patriotic British subject. Satow was with his father when on leave from Japan in the summers of 1869 and 1870. They went to Germany with Satow's mother in 1869, and Satow went with his father to the baths at Bad Neuenahr, also in Germany, in the following year. Margaret Satow finally passed away at the age of 87 on the 10th of September 1899. She had been brought up as a Congregationalist, and Satow recorded that it was a great sadness to her that none of her children, as they grew up, could be persuaded to share her views. Satow himself became an Anglican in later years. Satow's elder brothers and sisters were Selina, 10 years older than Ernest, who died of tuberculosis at the age of 19, Agneta, 8 years older, whose daughter Helen researched into Erasmus and married Percy Allen, the warden of Corpus Christi College, Oxford, and Lucy, 7 years older, who died unmarried at the age of 21. Next came David, who was the eldest son. He married twice and followed his father in a financial career. One of his sons, Lawrence, became a captain in the Royal Navy. The fourth sister was Augusta. She became a scholar of Greek and Dante's Divine Comedy, and she married a don of Exeter College, Oxford, by the name of Henry Tozer. Edward, who was almost 3 years older than Ernest, also followed a financial career, but died in Shanghai of cholera at the age of 25 on the 13th of September, 1865. Mary, who was 2 years older than Ernest, had a daughter, Josephine, who married her naval cousin, Lawrence. Josephine and Lawrence are buried with Satow, Ernest Satow, in Ottery St. Mary. One of Mary's sons, Percy, married Agneta's daughter, Helen, to create further complications in the family tree. Nothing much is known of Ernest's younger brothers, Theodore and Charles, although the latter had a large family. The youngest brother, Samuel, or Sam, became a solicitor, and his son Harold was consul general in Beirut and Tunis. Another son, Christopher, became a commander in the Royal Navy, submarine commander, actually. Ernest was a clever, bright-eyed, dark-haired boy of slim build. Furthermore, he was the only one of the 11 brothers and sisters to enter university. This must have made him special in the eyes of his parents, who certainly placed great emphasis on a good education. After a succession of governesses, he attended a small private school conducted on Pestalozzian lines, which partly consisted in making use of the elder boys under the names of monitors to teach the younger ones. Not only was this respectable educational theory, but it made sound business sense by reducing costs. Then at the age of 13, he was sent to Mill Hill, now a well-known minor public school, but in 1856, just a small school for the sons of nonconformists with only 75 boys. Within 3 years, Sato had worked his way up to the top of the school, and in the summer of 1859, he won a Bousfield, B-O-U-S-F-I-E-L-D, scholarship to University College in London, which had been founded in the 1820s for the sons of Jews and nonconformists who were in those days denied access to Oxford and Cambridge. Sato entered University College in 1859 as a precocious 16-year-old. At this time, there was a good deal of intellectual turmoil in the universities. Darwin's Origin of Species and J.S. Mill's On Liberty, John Stuart Mill, were published in that same year, and Herbert Spencer's Materialism was fashionable among students and lecturers. Spencer, an English sociologist and philosopher, had published the first part of his Principles of Psychology in 1855. Born in 1820, he was an early advocate of the theory of evolution and coined the phrase survival of the fittest, often mistakenly attributed to Darwin. Charles Darwin, that is. From a dissenting nonconformist family background like Sato, he had abandoned Christianity. This philosophical atmosphere certainly exerted a great influence on Sato. While at University College, young Ernest got his first taste of the East. He attended some Chinese lectures in the Cantonese dialect of dubious quality and usefulness given by James Summers, 1828 to 1891, the professor with no academic degree at King's College since 1852, there being no one else available having sufficient familiarity with the language. Sato was a passionate student of Western languages, both classical and modern. In later years, he was to publish brief articles in 2 short-lived periodicals edited by Summers, the Chinese and Japanese Repository, 1863 to 1865, and the Phoenix, 1870 to 1873. Sato made such good progress that he completed his degree studies in 2 years. His parents hoped strongly to send him on to Trinity College, Cambridge. However, Hagihara Nobutoshi, one of the leading Japanese scholars of Sato, has pointed out in Toigake, Distant Cliffs, that even though Cambridge University was more tolerant of nonconformists than Oxford, and he might have been allowed to study there, it is doubtful that he would have been allowed to proceed to a degree. The 2 ancient universities were not open fully to nonconformists or women until the Universities Religious Tests Act of 1871. The Isles of the Blessed. Chance intervened in young Sato's future when, at the age of 17, i.e. sometime in the second half of 1861 or the first half of 1862, while still at University College, he came across Lawrence Oliphant's Narrative of the Earl of Elgin's Mission to China and Japan in the years 1857, 58, and 59, which had been published in 2 volumes in 1859. China was described in the first volume and Japan in the second. Lord Elgin was the Governor General of India, and he had succeeded in signing the Treaty of Edo, called Tokyo after the Meiji Restoration, with the shogun's representatives, but without imperial approval, on the 26th of August, 1858. Oliphant was private secretary to Lord Elgin during the mission and was later to serve in the British legation in Japan. One of Sato's elder brothers, Edward, who died in Shanghai in 1865, had borrowed the book from Moody's Mobile Library. That's Moody, M-U-D-I-E. Sato wrote in his memoirs that the book inflamed his imagination with pictures verbal and colored of a country where the sky was always blue. The book portrayed a land where the sun shone perpetually and where the whole duty of man seemed to consist in lying on a matted floor with the windows open to the ground towards a miniature rockwork garden in the company of rosy-lipped, black-eyed and attentive damsels. In short, a realized fairyland. But that Sato should ever have a chance of seeing these Isles of the Blessed, as he called them, was still, as he expressed it in his memoirs, beyond my wildest dreams at this point. Here we find the nascent germ of young Sato's longing, excitement, and enthusiasm for Japan. The book which so fascinated Sato is indeed a fine production, with beautiful colored illustrations from original drawings and photographs of the Bay of Nagasaki, the city of Edo, and so on. There are also hints of sexual liberation in such statements as, in Japan, religion is not used, as in some countries, to conceal immorality, but rather to give it countenance and support. Such heady notions must have seemed intriguing to the young man in his stiflingly prim and strict family home. Soon afterwards, Sato read an account of the American Commodore Perry's first expedition to Japan of 1853 in the black ships, Kurofune in Japanese. This reinforced his interest in Japan to the point of obsession. He wrote in his memoirs that he thought of nothing else from that time onwards. Sato's good fortune continued as he discovered, lying on a table in the college library, a notice that 3 nominations to student interpretarships in the consular service in China and Japan had been placed at the disposition of the Dean of University College. Until 1859, nomination by one's university had meant automatic recruitment, but from 1860, a competitive examination was organized by the Civil Service Commissioners for students at London University and certain Scottish and Irish universities between the age of 18 and 24. Sato obtained permission to enter the competition with difficulty from his anxious parents, who were no doubt unwilling to see their son travel to such a remote and dangerous country. There were 14 candidates, of whom 11 were successful. The examination included handwriting, arithmetic, précis writing, geography, geometry, and translation from Latin and French into English. Sato, who was only just old enough by a few hours to be a candidate, came top of the examination. The other 2 candidates from University College failed. In his memoir, Sato wrote of the uncertainty of such examinations. This is quoting. The scheme of examination is no test of the linguistic capabilities of the men, and sometimes sends into the service those who can no more learn to speak a foreign language than they can fly. Furthermore, they took no account of moral qualities, and the process of cramming and spewing out facts in an examination was one which disgusted him. As a result of his academic success, of which he wrote modestly that it was due to his having left school more recently than the other competitors, Sato was given first choice between China and Japan and chose the latter. He never expressed or felt any interest in China. One other successful candidate, R.A. Jamieson, who was placed 7th in the examination, also chose Japan. The remaining 9 all chose China. So it was that on the 20th of August, 1861, Sato was appointed by a standard letter from the Foreign Office, which stressed that the primary object of the appointment was that he should study the Japanese language for subsequent interpreting or translating duties. Letters of appointment to previous appointees, A. Ansley, F. Myborough, F. M. Cowan, and Richard Eusden, had instructed them to study Japanese and Dutch, but by this time it was felt that Dutch was a barrier to effective communication and intelligence gathering. Sato was also instructed in the same letter to acquire an insight into the way in which business in consulates was conducted. This latter instruction was to be the cause of much resentment to Sato, as it in practice condemned him to many hours of ultra-tedious office work, called chancery work, which in the days before photocopiers mainly consisted of copying the long, dull, and prolix dispatches of his superiors for distribution to other consular offices, often in quintuplicate. It was felt by the Foreign Office to be the best way to train junior officials to understand current issues. Not only was this very boring, but it also took up time in which Sato keenly desired to study Japanese. Yet Sato's experience was typical for student interpreters in the short-staffed consular services of the Far Eastern Triangle of China, Japan, and Siam, and the Foreign Office made clear its policy of sharing out chancery work on numerous occasions. In 1865, A. B. Mitford, 1837 to 1916, was obliged to do the same kind of work copying out Sir Rutherford Alcock's interminable dispatches in Peking, even though he was a member of the diplomatic service. He wrote that in the stifling heat, it was like being a private secretary to Satan himself. However, Sato was still blissfully ignorant of such bureaucratic nightmares. He wisely applied to the Foreign Office for permission to postpone his departure until he had got his BA, which was granted, and he sat for his final examination at University College in October. That would be 1861. The other successful candidates had left by the first available boat on the 4th of September. Sato left Southampton full of joyful anticipation at the adventure which beckoned on the 4th of November, 1861. He sailed at 3 p.m. on the 2,000-ton P&O wooden paddle steamer Indus, waving farewell to his father and mother who stood on the wharf as the ship left harbour. His diary or journal, kept in the Public Record Office, begins on this day. Well, now it's kept in the National Archives at Kew, to the west of London. A report in the Times of the 3rd of October, 1861, of the attack on the British legation at Tozenji Temple in Edo on the 5th of July, in which Lawrence Oliphant, by now secretary of the legation, was seriously wounded, had prompted Sato to include a revolver in his luggage. This was a standard precaution for Westerners in Japan throughout the dangerous 1860s. Oliphant was subsequently invalided out of the Foreign Office, became a member of Parliament, and finally, in 1867, joined a strange cult in the United States headed by one Thomas Lake Harris, no relation of the first American consul, Townsend Harris, called the Brotherhood of the New Life, in which he became known by the name of Woodbine and learned to sew petticoats. Strange. Some 20 Japanese joined him, including Mori Arinori from Satsuma, the first Minister of Education in the Meiji period. Kicking his heels in China. We've got a quotation here, starting this section. Sato of the Japan Consular Service, destined to become successively Minister to Japan and China, in his aloof maturity, a fearsomely correct figure, was briefly posted to China in his arrogant youth and booted his disobedient boy downstairs with 2 good kicks. From the China Consuls by P.D. Coates, page 45. Sato's arrival at his cherished ultimate goal was delayed, to his great surprise and chagrin, by an enforced sojourn in China from January to September 1862. Sato did not know that he was to be detained in China to study Chinese for a year and a half, as his diary notes, until he actually got to Shanghai on the 16th of January, 1862. He recorded his astonishment in his diary. Yet it was perhaps beneficial to his career in the long term that it began in China, because the Foreign Office considered China a much more prestigious posting and more important for trade than Japan, which was still an unknown quantity with minuscule trade. The reason for the delay was that Sir Rutherford Alcock, Her Majesty's first Minister Plenipotentiary and Envoy Extraordinary in Japan from 1859 to 1864, had accepted the recommendations put forward by W.H. Medhurst, an interpreter in the Chinese Consular Service, who had visited Japan and noted that there were many shop signs that he could read, that a basic knowledge of Chinese characters was necessary for the study of Japanese. Alcock was disappointed with the progress of student interpreters in learning the Japanese language and frustrated that no one on the legation staff could as yet read Japanese. It made dealings with the mendacious, in quotation marks, Japanese all the more difficult. Of course, this was not part of Sato's plan at all, and it is clear that he was highly impatient to get to Japan. In his diary, he noted on the 2nd of February 1862 that when Alcock went on leave to England, he would have to try to get Dr. Winchester, then consul in Shanghai, to let him go over to Japan. On Sunday, the 18th of May, Sato noted that Robertson, a Japanese student of more than 1 year's standing, had joined him and Jamieson in Peking for the same foolish, idiotic, waste-timeful purpose. Quoting from his diary. In his memoirs, Sato commented on Medhurst's theory that though an acquaintance with Chinese characters may be found useful by the student of Japanese, it is no more indispensable than that of Latin is to a person who wishes to acquire Italian or Spanish. This was an astute and scholarly observation, for although the Japanese language used characters which originated in China, the readings and meanings, to say nothing of the writing styles, were often quite different. This is still true in the present day. Eventually, the arrival of a note in Japanese from Edo, which no Chinese could make out, much less understand, was the death knell of the theory, and the student interpreters were shipped off to Japan immediately. This was also probably welcomed by Lieutenant Colonel Neale, N-E-A-L-E, the chargé d'affaires in Japan, while Alcock was absent on leave, who needed to strengthen his overworked staff. Satow's private diaries for this period in China reveal something of his personality and eagerness to study. He began the study of Chinese characters and even started learning Manchu. On the 17th of February, he sketched a Chinese man grinding corn with pencil in a very rough hand and copied some characters from a shop front without knowing their meaning. On the 12th of April, he breakfasted in Peking with the minister Frederick Bruce, Lord Elgin's younger brother, whom Satow described as a fine tall old fellow with a noble forehead and brown eyes. He was introduced to Mr. Wade, the Chinese secretary and a great scholar, destined eventually to teach Chinese at Cambridge. Wade interrogated young Satow vigorously with a view to finding out whether he had any particular talent for languages. Satow felt that he had not made a favorable impression. 2 days later, he, quotation marks, wasted the morning in what is technically called knocking about. After tiffin, which is Anglo-Indian for a light lunch, a man came with curios and he bought a snuff bottle for 6pence. He also bought a map of Peking for sightseeing. On Easter Day, Satow saw High Mass celebrated in the Roman Catholic Church in Peking. However, on the 2nd of February, he had mentioned cutting church for skating at the persuasion of Middleton, a fellow student interpreter. He did this with certain qualms of conscience and asked his diary if it was right to skate on a Sunday, concluding that the matter was for wiser heads than his to answer, as it required some thinking about. We may conclude from this and other diary entries that he was not inclined to religion at this period of his life. The influence of the free-thinking materialism at University College seems to have combined with the reaction against his strongly religious family background and his inclination toward immorality. China also clearly showed a less flattering side of Satow's personality. According to his diary on the 29th of May, Satow forced his way into the Temple of Heavenly Peace, and on the 22nd of June, Satow kicked his servant downstairs with 2 good kicks. That's quotation marks. It's from his diary. These actions, it has been argued, show a lack of cultural sensitivity and a sense of superiority towards Asians, which was then prevalent among Westerners. It also indicates Satow's immaturity and arrogance, as the servant had only asked repeatedly if he could accompany Satow to Japan. Even worse behavior was born of boredom, frustration, and impatience. In Peking, Satow was a member of a wild and ill-disciplined gang of tearaways. He and Herbert J. Allen, a fellow student interpreter, not a relative, who had passed the exam at the same time as Satow and was destined to become a consul in the China service in 1877, spent a Sunday morning shooting at the roof ornaments of the Hanlin Academy, a famous institute of Chinese learning. 8 students caused 3 accidents in one day by cantering around street corners, and the Chinese complained of student behavior in a temple. On instructions from the disgusted Bruce, Wade told them that anyone offending the Chinese again would be severely disciplined, and particularly warned them against entering the Temple of Heaven unless the gate was willingly opened in return for a gratuity. The students, including Satow, responded by climbing over the Temple of Heaven wall again that same afternoon. As Coates points out, it seems that Satow had forgotten about such youthful indiscretions when he became minister in Peking in 1900. At that time, he controlled the service with an iron hand and a total absence of humor, says Coates. On the other hand, on the 8th of May, Satow recorded in his diary that he took his horse to the Temple of the Earth before breakfast to catch butterflies. On the 22nd of May, he included a pencil drawing of a temple, and on the 30th of June, we find the ironic observation, "I am 19 years old today. What a frightful age." In his memoir, Satow writes of early morning rides over the plain in the north of Peking, the dirt and dust of the streets, the pink lotus blossoms on the lake of the Marble Bridge, and the carts bumping over the stone pavements worn into deep ruts. It was, quotation marks, a strange Eastern life that surrounded a band of boys fresh from school or college or their mother's apron strings. Old Nippon at last. Again, we begin this section with a quotation. It was one of those brilliant days that are so characteristic of Japan, and as we made our way up the Bay of Yedo, I thought no scenery in the world could surpass it. Irregular shaped hills covered with dark green trees lined the whole southern coast, and above them rose into the air for 12,000 feet and more the magnificent cone of Fuji, with scarcely a patch of snow visible. From A Diplomat in Japan by ERNEST Sato. Sato left Peking on the 6th of August, 1861, bound for Shanghai by way of Tientsin and Taku. He left Shanghai on the 2nd of September, 1862. I'm sorry, I said 1861 just now. 1862, in the steamer Lancefield, with another student interpreter, Russell B. Robertson, who had been delayed in China due to ill health and was to become British consul at Yokohama from 1871 until his death in 1888. The third member of the group, R.A. Jamieson, had fallen by the wayside in Shanghai. He had left the consular service to start a newspaper at the end of August, on the persuasion of James Whittall, the Shanghai manager of Jardine, Matheson and Company, who had dispatched Jardine's first ship to Japan in 1859. Sato must have envied Jamieson the proposed annual salary of £1,000. This was 5 times Sato's modest £200 stipend earned as a student interpreter, and in between the annual salary of the vice consul in Shanghai, which was £750, and the consul, £1,500. Diplomatic service was better paid than the consular service. The minister in Edo received £2,500 at this time. 6 days after leaving Shanghai, the Lancefield steamed into the Bay of Edo. Sato recorded the scene with delighted enthusiasm in his memoirs. Curious duck-shaped boats of pure unpainted wood jostled on the sparkling waters. The sunburnt fishermen were naked but for a loincloth. At last, the white cliffs of Mississippi Bay became closer and more distinct. We rounded Treaty Point and dropped anchor on the outer edge of the shipping. After the lapse of more than a year, I had at last attained my cherished object. Sato was driven not only by a strong curiosity about the country which was still unknown to him, but also by a desire to escape from his family and from the rigid morality, class, and religious discrimination of Victorian England. He left behind a society in which an Oxbridge degree meant far more than it does today in terms of status and prestige. Nonconformists were still not fully accepted, and the diplomatic service, at least in the major European embassies, was monopolized by French-speaking alumni of Oxford and Cambridge with Foreign Office connections. An added obstacle was that members of the diplomatic service were expected to have a private income, as their salaries could not match their extravagant lifestyles. Foreign Office employees at the time were divided broadly into 2 groups: those who spent most of their working lives in London and those who worked almost entirely abroad. The latter group was divided strictly into the diplomatic and consular services. The consular service was itself divided into 3 sections: a general service operating throughout the world for the protection of trade, the Levant service covering parts of the Near and Middle East, and the China service, which was the model for the Japan service. While there was some movement between the home and overseas postings, the chances of upward mobility from the consular to the diplomatic service were very small. The only reason that Alcock, Parkes, and Sato achieved the promotion was that they were Far East specialists destined to work exclusively in China, Japan, or Siam. Sato was a young man full of enthusiasm, kicking over the traces. He was clearly in revolt against his family upbringing. A comparison may be made with Sato's good friend, Dr. William Willis, who had arrived in Japan aged 25 in May 1862, anxious to earn money to maintain a housemaid at the Middlesex Hospital, Maria Fisk, and illegitimate son whom he had left behind. The difference in age and maturity notwithstanding, both Willis and Sato were, in a sense, escaping from England by coming to Japan. On the 8th of September 1862, Sato arrived in Yokohama and set foot on Japanese soil for the first time. His long association with the land of his dreams had begun. That is the end of chapter 1. I think that's long enough and far enough to read, at least for the time being. I thank you for listening and watching if you have done, and I'll see you again next time. Thank you and goodbye.